the Legal Corner podcast series. Welcome to today's episode of The Legal Corner, a podcast which covers a variety of legal issues to keep you informed. Hosted by attorney at law Colin Dinoon and communications specialist Leonardo Torres. Good day to all, and welcome to another episode of the Legal Corner podcast series. Now, as you can see in the title of this episode, highlights a reflection on our favorite episodes. This, unfortunately, will be our penultimate episode here at the Legal Corner podcast series, and it will be, of course, a reflection on Colin and I's favorite episodes throughout our podcast series. As you know, we have had this podcast since season 1. It's well over 2 years already that we have had this podcast. I remember we started this podcast through the throes of a pandemic. And now that the worst of that is behind us, we have only just matured and continued giving you all great content. So let's get to one of our favorite episodes. So this episode was back in season 1, episode 7, and the title of this episode was Divorce Proceedings in Trinidad and Tobago. And our guest of honor for this episode was none other than Miss Renee Aaron, who is a founder and lead attorney at Millennial Chambers. Now, why this episode was one of our favorites, apart from generally speaking, it was well received, is the fact that Colin and I learned so much, particularly me. As you know, I'm not an attorney, but I learned a lot in this episode. And yeah, let's just give it a listen to this little snippet of this episode and enjoy.
Upon what ground can a person file for divorce?
Well, in Trinidad and Tobago, there is only one ground that you must satisfy the court in order to obtain a divorce. And that one ground is that the marriage has broken down irretrievably. Basically meaning that there is no hope of reconciliation.
All right. And that ground will be supported by various facts.
Yes. Well, in order to prove this one ground, there are 5 facts that is laid out in the legislation that one can use to satisfy that one ground. So those 5 facts are that 1, that your spouse committed adultery; 2, that your spouse's behavior is so unreasonable that you cannot continue to live with them; 3, that your spouse you and your spouse have lived separate and apart for 2 years, and that the other party consents to the divorce; or that you and your spouse have lived separate and apart for 5 years, or that your spouse has abandoned you. So those are 5 facts that you could rely on in order to satisfy the one ground that the marriage has broken down irretrievably.
Yes, so again, that was Miss Renee Aaron. She joined us also for another episode in season 1. This was episode 18, entitled Adverse Possession. And in that episode as well, she shared a lot of information with us. It was actually one of our good episodes as well. We really enjoyed having Miss Aaron on. And again, a wholehearted thank you. So let's move on to our second favorite episode. And this one is entitled The Role of the Corporate Secretary. Now, this episode stemmed from season 2. It was episode 15. And our guest of honor for that episode was Mr. Darwin Manzano, who himself is a corporate secretary at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. What was special about this episode for us is at that time, Colin and I had a very busy schedule. So we were unable to host, but we just wanted to keep the momentum going. And we were so happy that we could have called on Miss Danae Lahman, who is an attorney at law and an author. Her book is entitled Juice That Orange. And she was our guest host for that episode, and she stepped in, and we were so thankful that she brought a different touch to the podcast series. And let's give this clip a listen.
Who is a corporate secretary?
Very interesting question, Daniel. A corporate secretary, in my view, well, according to legislation, is an officer of a company, clothed with certain responsibilities and duties to act on behalf of a company.
Great. So how does one become a corporate secretary? How are they appointed?
In the appointment of a corporate secretary is done primarily. The procedure is based in the legislation. The board of directors have that responsibility for appointing the corporate secretary to the company. They are guided by the legislation, which gives some guidelines for public companies. And if I would quote from the legislation, would speak of a person who the legislation sets out some qualification that they should have. For example, someone who had held the office of secretary or assistant secretary or deputy secretary of a public company, or someone who at least 3 or 5 years immediately preceding their appointment as secretary held the office of secretary of a public company, someone who is a member in good standing in its Institute of Chartered Accountants of Trinidad and Tobago and the Association of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators of Trinidad and Tobago, or the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accounting. Also someone who is an attorney at law, or by virtue of holding or having held the office or position, or other positions, having been a member of any body which appears to be capable of discharging the function of a secretary of a public company, may be assumed by the directors of a public company to have the requisite knowledge and experience to discharge that function of a secretary or assistant secretary of a company. I say all of that to just reinforce the point that the secretary is appointed by the board, and the board must satisfy themselves that that person who is appointed have the requisite skills and experience to carry out the responsibilities of the secretary. Those are some of the examples. For example, a chartered accountant, an attorney at law, or someone who have held that position before, but have had the experience. But the bottom line is that the board must be satisfied that that person who they appoint has the necessary skills and experience, and capability, competence, etc., to carry out the duties, the roles, and function of a company secretary.
Yes, so that is the role of the corporate secretary. And again, we want to thank Mr. Darwin Manzano and, of course, our guest host, Mr. Neil Lamont. This episode would not have been possible without you guys. So our next episode, that was one of our favorites, is entitled Alternative Dispute Resolution. Now, in the legal world, it's just simply called ADR. And this episode can be found in season 2, episode 18. And our guest of honor for this episode was Mr. Owen Monyan. And he is an associate at Philip Lytle. And we were so happy to have this episode recorded because we were able to travel to another destination. The legal podcast series was on the road. As you know, Mr. Owen resides in the United States, and we were happy to have him on our podcast series. So just give this clip a listen and let us know what you think about it.
What exactly is ADR?
Well, Colin, ADR stands for Alternative Dispute Resolution. And alternative dispute resolution is essentially any form of dispute resolution other than litigation. When we think of resolving disputes, we automatically think of going to court. We don't have to go to court. There are other ways to resolve disputes. The most common alternatives to litigation are arbitration and mediation. So that's primarily what we're thinking of when we speak about ADR.
Tell us, what is the difference between arbitration and mediation?
Arbitration and mediation are two very different things. Arbitration is more similar to what people think of when they think about litigation in court, except that instead of being in a court, it's in a private venue. and the parties pay a private individual to essentially step into the shoes of a judge and decide the outcome of the dispute between them, applying the law. Mediation is a very different thing. Mediation is where parties agree to attempt to resolve their dispute themselves with the assistance of a neutral mediator. And that mediator's role is usually merely to facilitate the parties in reaching an agreement, not necessarily based on their legal rights, but a pragmatic solution that they can both live with. So the person deciding the outcome in mediation is the parties themselves. The person deciding the outcome in arbitration is an arbitrator. So in that sense, arbitration is more similar to litigation.
Much thanks again to Mr. Owen Manyan. It was such a pleasure having you on the Legal Corner podcast series. And yes, that was quite an informative soundbite, so to speak. So now we are on to our final favorite. This episode can be found in season 1. It was our last episode in season 1, which was number 24. And the title for this episode was Life on and Off the Bench. And we were so happy to have a very prominent person in the legal field. She is Mrs. Lucina Cardenas Ragunanan, and she's a former senior magistrate, a resident of San Fernando. And we were so happy to have her on our episode as she gave such a beautiful insight to her career and her life on and off the bench, as we named the episode. So give it a listen. You are a former senior magistrate,
Yes.
right? Can you tell us, in your own words, what were the early days of your career like?
Okay, well, let me just go back a little bit, because before I joined the magistracy, the judiciary, I after graduating from the University of the West Indies, I also attended at Barbados, because in those days we would go 2 years in Barbados before we can qualify. So it was 1 year here and then 2 years in Barbados and then 2 years here at the Hewarding Law School. After I came out, now this is a very interesting little thing and I'm going to tell you, which much people don't know. But I decided, you know what, I'm not going straight into out there at all. I'm just going to take a little year off and see where I'm going. And I decided, I'm sorry, this is before I went to university. I decided that, you know what, I'm going to apply to be an air hostess. So I signed up to be an air hostess with BWE, and I did all the training, of course. I passed all of my interviews, and here we are getting ready to be called. And there went BWE into some trouble. They had they closed down BWE. So, okay, no way, you're not going to go there again. I said, all right, no problem. What shall I do now? I was reading the newspapers, and I saw there was an advertisement in Naparima for Naparima boys, a history teacher, a teacher. I am 18 years or 19 years at the time. And I said, well, you know what, I can do that. So I drove up to the school and I went to the principal, who was then Mr. Mackenzie. And I said to Mr. Mackenzie, he asked, what are you doing here? I said, well, you know, I saw you had an advertisement and I thought maybe I can come and teach. So he said, is that right? I said, yes. Well, I've just finished my A-levels. I haven't received results yet, but maybe I can do this. He said, okay, well, when do you want to start? I said, well, do you want me to come now or what? And he said, well, no, you'll come tomorrow. And there began me teaching boys from 1 to 5, from 1s to 5, history of all the things in the world. Now, I'm telling you this because that background of history played a great, great part in my success. And I do believe I have been successful in my ability to read and understand and have a greater knowledge of the world and how things were and how they are now. And, you know, as well as my interaction with lots of young people. So there began my interaction with young people from a different perspective, not just as friends or hanging around people, but imparting some kind of knowledge to them, which I must pat myself on the back because I didn't do too badly. At the end of it all, they did pass their history, despite the many distractions they may have had at the time, because I was one of the youngest new girl that came into town. Nevertheless, and I'm also proud to say that quite a few of my students, I see them now, and they can't believe it. I said, "Oh my God, I can't recognize you." They recognize me, and I don't recognize them, and they're in some good positions in the country. I'm proud of them. Needless to say, I went on to do law, and then I always felt I started my practice in San Fernando. I first was called as a solicitor. In those days, there was solicitors, and not there was a division in terms of solicitors as opposed to barristers, who would have been advocates, those persons that go and argue in the court. The solicitors would prepare the documentation, file, and then the advocates would go in and argue. Of course, sometime thereafter, we became attorneys at law, which would mean there is no distinction. You can do both. Once you have a practicing certificate, you come out there and you can practice whichever way you want. I had been doing quite a bit of magistrates court matters, mainly family, maintenance, custody, and things like that, and attended that court. And I really felt a little bit, it's not sad, but I was very concerned, I would say. Concerned because I felt that a lot of people weren't getting justice. I felt that they were not really being heard, particularly the women, quite as much the men. I'm not discussing any aspersions at all on the officers, the judicial officers, but the system somehow did not seem to allow for real justice to take place. So I always felt, to my gosh, if I was on top there, I would not do that. I would try to see how fair I can be. And this sort of prompted me in my mind, where can I make this difference? Because even though I might have been representing people in my own private capacity, there's not more, you can't do more than that, because it's always left, of course, to the judicial officer. He or she has the power to do many things. And after a while, I decided I would apply to be a magistrate. I was actually encouraged by quite a few prominent, well-read and well-thought persons. I wouldn't name any names because I don't want people to think that I'm singling out anybody. But the late Mrs. Lynette Maraj was very instrumental, as well as Mr. Basdev Pandey, who I was being at Kelshol and Company. He was one of the advocates for them. And so we had a good relationship in terms of the work, and they did recommend me. And yes, I got the job.
Yes, so personally, that was my favorite. And I've really just saved the best for last. But all of our 4 were really, really good episodes. We were so thankful to have such a wide cross-section of attorneys of different specialties, different levels in their career, whether some of them were junior, some of them were quite senior in their career. We had people who ran their own practice, people who operated within a practice. And they all brought something special to the Legal Corner podcast series. And we were so happy to have all of them, not just these 4 episodes that I'm talking about here, but throughout the length and breadth of our podcast series, all 4 seasons. So again, a heartfelt thanks to all of our guests. And yeah, stay tuned to our final episode, which will be next. And Colin will be joining us for that episode. So stay tuned. Thank you for listening to the Legal Corner podcast series. For more information, please visit us at our Facebook or Instagram pages, or send your comments to thelegalcornerpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you.